Today I'm going to be showing you guys how I recreated Malibu Nights by LANY. Somebody asked for it, so we're doing it. This is honestly one of my favorite songs that they've ever done, and it's actually the title track of my favorite album that they've ever done. I'm going to go over how to get complex piano performances even if you're not the best piano player, using muted guitar as a percussion layer, and even some weird stuff like throwing chorus on drums. But before we get into all that, let me introduce myself. Hi, my name is Seth. I work as a guitar-based pop producer. I do one of these videos every Friday to show people how to create their own pop music at home. Songs I've either produced or written have been featured on these Spotify curated playlists, and I did an entire album through Warner Music Group. So if you like this video and it seems like we'd have fun working on a project together, check out the top link in my description. All right, on to the rest of the video. So this song is predominantly piano-led. Like for a majority of the track, it is just piano. So really quick, I thought I would go over one of my favorite ways to create piano performances, even though I'm not like the most adept piano player. And it basically comes into splitting your performance into different hands. So recording one hand at a time. So a very simple way to view it is to view your left hand here. Normally I'm either just playing the root of the chord, or here a root and a fifth, or if I want it to be really chunky, octaves of the root with a fifth in between the two of them. But I will do one pass of recording MIDI and I'll just do these lower chords. So it will basically sound like this. And then I'll go in and adjust the velocities of the MIDI so that they're kind of where I want them to be. You just don't want one chord or one note of one chord being like really louder than the others. So just kind of bring them generally into the same range. I also know a lot of people who use the velocity tool in Ableton to get sort of a similar effect. But after we have our chords recorded, and I'm normally using the sustain pedal with my MIDI controller, I will then record the right hand on top of that. And it's really cool because since I've already tracked the chords with the sustain pedal, I don't even need to worry about using the sustain pedal because that MIDI information is already tracked in. And so I can just make something that melodically flows. If you really struggle with making anything sound good on a piano, I would recommend keeping your thumb on the fifth of whatever key you're in, and then just noodle around on the scale with your other fingers. For pop music, at least, it tends to create something that's usable. And then when you put them all together, they sound like this. Sounds very organic and natural. Also, a thing that really helps things feel a bit more real is quantizing just the lower chords and leaving all this upper right-hand stuff unquantized. So you have these little bits of your performance leaking through where you're hitting them a little bit before the downbeat and then a little bit after, and it just makes it feel really natural. This is what I would call like the verse section. And then you can see when we go to this next section, the piano is very different. So for this guy, I don't even think I tracked the right hand. I think I literally took that root in fifth that I already had tracked, and then I just transposed them down an octave, and then I duplicated the roots an octave up here. And you can also see I turned up their velocities a lot more, so they're really chunky. And then again, with the right hand, I just sort of noodled around until I came up with something that I thought melodically felt right. And again, for all of this stuff, I'm actually using a pretty cheap MIDI controller here. And so normally when you're tracking stuff like this with a cheap controller, the biggest difference you notice is the velocities are pretty inconsistent. So you might have to go in and tweak some of them so that they're sort of in the same range. You don't want to make them all exactly the same because then it starts to sound really fake. But yeah, all of that results in a really dynamic piano performance that sounds really real, but is actually all MIDI and was actually pretty easy to come up with. Now for the actual sound itself, for this guy, I used the Maverick piano from Contact. I normally use Addictive Keys, but this one needed a little bit more low end, and I do find that the Addictive Keys pianos tend to not have a lot of low end in them, just something I've noticed. But yeah, then I'm also using a little bit of C4, and I'm actually using this as more of a performance dynamic compression, if that makes sense. So when we're in this soft part here, it's barely triggering at all. And then when we get to here and it's really digging in, this mid-range is really taming it a lot. So you can see here, just a little bit. Then when it gets here, you can even see the low end triggering a bit there. Then we used a little bit of MoTT to sort of bring some brightness up, compress it a little bit, or a lot, I guess. Some EQ to cut out the low end because a piano, just as a reminder, can go really low in the frequency spectrum. So you really want to make sure that you're not leaving this unhigh passed unless you are doing something like a mix that is just piano with nothing else in it. And then at the end here, we actually have utility, which is actually my preferred way of doing volume automation in Ableton. I will just add one of these to the end of my chain and then automate the gain up or down for certain sections. And the reason I like doing that is because if I were to automate the volume here, like on the fader, you then start getting into these weird places where if you've automated it up for certain sections, but then you want to like raise it up or lower it here just in this specific section, you now have to deal with like moving all of the automation for the song. Whereas with this utility plugin, you can just kind of set the dynamic relationship you want for different sections, and then you still have your fader here to control your volume overall, but it'll keep that automation unaffected. That's just my preferred way of doing it. On the sends, we're using some Valhalla vintage verb, which I am coming around on. For a long time, I didn't really buy into the hype of Valhalla just because so many people I know have it and swear by it. But now that I have it, I'm like, okay, I get it now. So we're using like a very 80s dark chamber sound and then a little bit of ROM. Again, I use it on pretty much everything. Those guys are pretty much always on like my default Ableton template, which is something you can do, by the way. You can take a session and you can make like template sessions, which I highly recommend doing because it's a great time saver. Next, we're going to be looking at our pads and our synths. These are all sort of dynamically brought in. So this first one here is sort of a band-passed soft pad. So that guy is this angelic voice in Arcade. I really like pads that have a lot of texture and flutter to them, which is why sometimes I prefer more organic sound design based pads than just straight playing a synth pad, because very rarely do you get that sort of like organic flutter that happens when it's like a sample based pad. But yeah, band passed it like crazy. Underneath that, I had this string texture here. Then underneath that, we have this pad, which is acoustic textures. And you can actually see here, I actually automated some filter stuff so that when it starts out here, it's very low. It's just adding a little bit of like high-end sparkle. But then when it goes to the bigger drop, it sort of filters up. It's very subtle. But yeah, these guys are just sort of tickling your ears for most of it. And then they kind of filter up near the end here into the bridge. And then we have this guy, which is from Distant Voices Pantheon. This guy, they are just doing like a root and a fifth. And I added this one just because I did hear in Malibu Nights, there was a bit of a, I want to say almost like a vocal texture thing in the background. It's very light, but it's very bright in the high end. And I wanted to just incorporate that in some way. And then down here, we have just a little bit of a vocal chop. Just because when I was listening to that sort of like last chorus, which is where a majority of these production elements come in, I really like the way that Paul sort of has these like vocal ad-libs in there. And I feel like they just add a bit of spice to everything. But yeah, in terms of mixing, I'm not really doing a whole lot of processing on them. But I am using that same like utility gain automation thing here to sort of bring them up once the actual beat drops. Now we're coming to my favorite part, which are the guitars. So I was able to get pretty close to the original tone, I felt like, with this Corey Wong archetype patch called 80s Chorus Rhythm. I tweaked it a lot from the original patch, so if you want to look at my settings here, this is what I did. It originally has this like tube driver on. I turn that off. I turn off the drive switch here, adjust the EQ a bit, turn the volume up a ton. This is really boosted, I think, on the original patch. And then I think I turned up the chorus a lot. But yeah, this with a Strat was really just the whole tone, which I was really happy with. It just has that really simple melody that it adds on top of the arrangement. And considering that leading up to this point in the song, there is like zero guitar, it just really shines and feels almost like an epic solo, even though it's like a very simple lead line played on a Strat that's almost just a clean crunch tone, but it feels massive in the song when it comes in just because it's preceded by, 3 minutes of just piano and pads. Something I think is really cool is this guy here. this sort of like slappy percussive element that's just picking the lower strings on the Strat and using it almost as like a percussive element. And I think this is kind of like John Mayer influenced, because I know Paul from LANY loves John Mayer. But sometimes when John Mayer is doing like a solo or something like that, he'll do that sort of like like into the lead line. I did it a little bit here with this guy, like this sort of 16th note up and down stroke leading into it. But then I feel like they did a separate take of it and it's just in the background almost as like a percussion layer thing. And it adds a lot to the beat, like just the movement of it all. So if I just take all of the elements that we have so far, just guitar, pads, and piano. And I just turn off that percussive guitar, it immediately is less head bobby than it was before. And it's just one simple layer. If you're to take any lesson away from like LANY style productions, is that it's very minimalist in their approach. It's like, how much can we get from like as few tracks as possible, which I love. Underneath all this, we have a Reese Bass. So an interesting choice with this song is it uses a Reese bass as like its main bass sound. Like it doesn't have an 808, it doesn't have a live bass player. This Reese bass sound, which is kind of normally used as, I almost want to say like a lower pad, like mid-range booster. Like normally people will take it and they'll like boost it an octave up and they'll blend that with their bass to make a sort of bridge between their synths and their bass. But here they just have it playing low and it's just their main bass sound, which is awesome. It has this very glidey feel to it, but it also has this very chorused feel. So it feels very wide and stereo. For this patch, I love the Essential preset in Anna 2. This is actually one that I'm using quite often. And then we're high passing it a bit and then low passing it, side chaining it to the kick. And then something I've been doing a lot recently with my basses is using something like this, like Brainworks, which has like this bass shift knob. And if you've watched this channel before, you know that I really love using something like mirror EQ when you're trying to get your bass and your kick to fit together. So you'll like find where your kick is resonant and then boost it. And then on your bass, you're going to cut that and then boost above it. And then on your kick, you'll do the opposite. You'll cut where you've boosted your bass and then boost that opposite area. And the reason I like plugins like this is that it's just kind of one knob, boom. And then I do that, high pass it a little bit. And then as you can see on my kick, I have done the very opposite. So yeah, stuff like that is really awesome. They also have the same thing for the presence range, which I found really practical when mixing lead vocals and background vocals. So I'll normally do like a bit of a boost here with my main vocal, and then I'll do sort of a cut here with all my background vocals so that my main vocal has an air to it that the rest of them don't have, so that the backups almost seem like a warm blanket that come around my main vocal. Then after that, we have our drums. For this guy, we're using BBL Kick CYFY Clunk. It's from the Bedroom Lo-Fi pack on Splice. As I said, I'm doing some high passing just to make sure that the aggressive low end of the sample isn't like trampling on the indie pop vibes that we have going. Like I even had to cut it on like a low shelf for a bit. But something interesting that I found that they did on the drums is, all right, I spent a lot of time trying to figure out how exactly to get the drum sound from this song. And I am like convinced they used like some kind of Juno chorus or flanger or something on the drums. I don't know why, but I've tried using it on and off, and it's like the only way I've been able to get anything relatively close to it. I could be totally wrong, but just from the way that the snare sort of gets like destroyed when it hits, and there's like this weird phasey filteriness on everything, and the high end is sort of degraded a bit, I just feel like they used something like a chorus on it. Now, the snare sample is very interesting, at least in how I've tried to recreate it. So what I've done is I've taken one snare sample to be my main sample, and then I've taken this rim sound and I've put it on two different drum racks, and I've panned one left and one right. And then I've gone in for those rims and I've slightly offset them from the actual downbeat of the snare, just because I felt like there was a really weird like stereo widening thing happening and I didn't really know how to get it organically other than something weird like this. So the kick and the snare have like a really interesting relationship here, because if you listen to it, like that little bum. It's like 4 on the floor with like a few extra hits every now and then. It's a very interesting vibe. And then when you have the snare with this like really weird effect, like this chorusing thing, it doesn't affect the kick that much, at least audibly, but with the snare, it's like a night and day thing. And then for sort of this like 16th sort of chugging motion, we have this tambourine and hi-hat. And it's interesting, you almost have the shaker performing the role of the hi-hat, and then these hi-hats are sort of accentuating the and of 8, like 1 and 2 and 3 and, like if I solo them all together. And then the last sound was this sort of sonar bleep. Once you realize that this is in the drum track, you can't not hear it because it like doubles the snare every once in a while. With this guy, you do need to go into the sample and make sure it is in the key of the song that you are doing, because it will sound terrible if it's not. And people have pointed out like it's weird how like I'll have one sample here and it's just in this sort of box, it looks like. So to clarify, normally when I'm bringing a sample in, it's something like this. And the reason that it looks like that box there is because what I will tend to do is I will make sure transients are good. We don't have an extra fade. Maybe I'll repitch it. Maybe I'll do some transient shaping, or maybe down in this menu down here. And then just to make it sort of easy to duplicate out, I will then just highlight the region, hit Control J, and it'll consolidate it and it will turn it into this one big block, because I can just hit duplicate now and it will just add it for the rest of the song. So that's why you see these big blocks everywhere. And then for the master, just to bring a little bit of roundness to it and mid-range honk, I have some Kramer tape going into L1, and I believe that's everything. So let's listen to what the entire track sounds like together. So yeah, hopefully you guys enjoyed that. I really loved breaking down this song specifically. By the way, this episode was made because somebody suggested it in the comments, so put them down in the comments below. If you watched this far, please hit the bell icon and all that subscribe stuff below. Legitimately helps this channel. Again, I do one of these videos every Friday. Hope you guys enjoyed this, and I will see you guys next week.